Good morning. Welcome to everybody joining this webinar today. My name is Andy Oliver, Senior Consultant here at Ramsgill Martin. This is our second webinar associated with contractual and planning issues and delay and disruption during the current COVID-19 pandemic. Our first webinar, if you missed it, was delivered in May by our Group CEO Clive Ramsgill and Managing Director Nick Cheetham, and covered the basics of planning and programming, delay analysis, and contractual and legal principles of the JCT and the NEC contracts. This webinar, called The Devil's in the Detail, will be delivered by our Senior Consultant Dean McGinty and Technical Director David Tatham. In summary, this webinar will cover COVID-19, this in relation to the government's industry guidance and the site operating procedures, delay and disruption, what the differences are and the different approaches, record keeping, considerations to be made when managing your projects, and common problems we see, the contract mechanisms regarding time and delay, this mainly focusing on the JCT and NEC contracts, and finally acceleration. What is it? How to manage the programme regarding acceleration, do's and don'ts, and again covering both the JCT and NEC contracts. There should be a questions box on your screen, which you're welcome to use to post any questions you have during or after the webinar. These questions will be directed to the appropriate person, and we will hopefully be able to answer them, and we'll respond to the questions by email within the next few days. In the meantime, I'll now pass you over to Dean for the first section.
Good morning. My name is Dean McGinty and I'm a Senior Claims Consultant here at Ramsgill Martin. And in this section what we're going to be looking at is COVID-19 and the impacts that's had on the construction industry. Now the UK entered lockdown on the 23rd of March 2020 and this created a great degree of uncertainty due to unprecedented measures that were put in place by the UK government. The key risks for the construction industry surround materials, labour and plant shortages. Now this is predominantly due to the fact that a lot of suppliers and subcontractors were operating the furlough scheme, so employees were unavailable to actually fulfil orders that were being put into place. This created delays in payment due to employers and contractors looking to protect cash flow and keep all that money in-house. Now this flows down through the supply chain and creates insolvency risk. There's reduction in the productivity levels as sites were still required to operate, however were having to put measures in place to maintain social distancing throughout the works. There's also contract uncertainty as potential damages and contra charges were levied, despite the fact that parties were unaware of where the risks sat and who was responsible for these delays. And finally, health and safety risks due to possible health and safety executive enforcement action in complying with this government guidance. Now, bear in mind that the construction industry never received specific orders to cease working as other industries did. The Construction Leadership Council released the site operating procedures in a way to provide guidance to construction sites on how best to protect themselves while keeping works going. Now Rev 1 was released on the 23rd of March 2020 and what this provided guidance was is continuing under Public Health England guidance, provided practical guidance on travelling to site, accessing site, hand washing facilities, the avoidance of close working and enhanced cleaning regimes to ensure that all that was possible was being done to try and prevent the virus from spreading. Revision 2 was released on the 2nd of April 2020, however this was almost immediately withdrawn. Following on from this, Rev 3 was released. Now this identifies that the Health and Safety Executive has enforcing authority, that sites are to monitor the implementation of these procedures. It provides further guidance on the sharing of transport and provides guidance where social distancing cannot be maintained. And then finally Rev 4 was released on the 18th of May. Now this provided minimal changes from Rev 3 other than that it linked the PPE to the government guidance, introduced the possibility of one-way systems and the challenges around site logistics that this causes, and then finally provided an update on the social distancing measures. Key considerations from the site operating procedures are allowing regular breaks for hand washing, specifically where the use of equipment is being used, both before and afterwards. Restricting the number of users for welfare facilities via the possible use of a welfare attendant. Works being unable to carry it out whilst maintaining social distancing should be considered and risk assessed via the recently introduced hierarchy of controls, which is to eliminate, reduce, isolate and control, along with additional focus being placed on the PPE and behaviours of the site operatives. As mentioned previously, the possible introduction of one-way systems to ensure that social distancing can be maintained, and the fact that the Health and Safety Executive can now enforce Public Health England guidelines. The effects of the site operating procedures being put in place are increased travel costs due to operatives having to travel alone or with a minimum number of people at all times, increased cost in preliminary items by hand cleaning stations being provided at site entrances, potentially increasing the number of site entrances to make sure that large crowds are not gathering around these points, regular cleaning of communal areas which would focus on welfare facilities, dining areas and reception areas, increasing the number of site inductions to maintain social distancing, possible welfare attendants being used to restrict the use of the facilities to a small number of people, and the possible increase in site supervision to ensure that all these measures and more are being implemented. This would also decrease productivity, as crowded areas are to be avoided at all times and works need to be planned around this to ensure that this is limited. Tasks to be carried out by one person, or where two people are undertaking these tasks, that a 2 metre distance is maintained at all times. That the minimum number of workers are involved in each task. Any more than this, the actual work needs to be considered about whether it needs to take place at all. Workers required to wash hands before and after the use of equipment. Now, specifically with small tools and plant, this could become quite onerous. And finally, the possible increase in the authorisation process to make sure that all these points are being considered prior to works commencing. Now, with the site operating procedures, these are guidance only. However, the legal health and safety obligations of the parties will still maintain priority. That said, the Health and Safety Executive can proceed with enforcement action if required. Now, this could also lead to a breach of contract for not complying with health and safety obligations. Despite all this, a contractor will still have their usual obligations under the CDM regulations. Now, there's due to be possibly no long-term closures of site, so therefore a proving delay could be quite difficult and the likely impact will be more productivity based. So to ensure that parties protect their rights to time and money, we would recommend that any event which is likely to cause delay or to both progress or the completion date is notified immediately. Failure to do so could result in any entitlement being lost. The productivity impact on the works due to staggered hours, one-way systems, additional hand cleaning and rearranging tasks to be carried out by one person. And then finally, for the recommended actions, some form of productivity-based analysis method should be used to track the impact this is having on labour efficiency. Ultimately, maintaining good records will be the key to ensuring that any party protects their right to seek additional time or money. And finally, any clear identifiable delays such as site closures should be notified separately.
So thank you, Dean. We're going to have a look now at delay and disruption in a bit more detail. We're going to look at the programme and we're going to look at ways in which delay and disruption can be recorded and monitored and how we can demonstrate entitlement. So it's probably useful just to have a quick look at the definitions. So delay is where an activity takes longer than planned. So if we have a brickwork activity, perhaps the construction of a wall, if the wall is planned to take 3 weeks but actually takes 4, then there's been a delay of 1 week. So that seems pretty straightforward to start with. And usually we're most interested in the activities that are on the critical path. So it's those activities that if they're delayed, they'll have an effect on the overall completion of the project. So we're interested in those because they'll be perhaps liquidated damages or general damages attached to that. And it's those delay events that we try and get an extension of time for, additional time. And disruption is really to do with less efficient working. So it's lower productivity than planned. So if we have people constructing a wall again and the rate of production is lower than planned, then we might need more bricklayers on site to achieve the planned overall rate of production, although each individual bricklayer is less productive. Or we might have to extend the working hours, and there could be additional costs related to that. And so we'd want to show that there's been disruption and try and establish that they're the entitlement to the additional costs that we've incurred. And of course, lower productivity could result in delay. So if we didn't have additional bricklayers on site, or if we didn't extend the working hours, then there'd be a delay to that brickwork activity, and that could be critical. And often disruption occurs to activities that aren't on the critical path. So there could be events that have caused disruption that we could have entitlement for, so we could get loss and expense for, even though they haven't caused a delay to the overall project. So if we just have a quick look at the practicalities of recording and measuring delay. So with the brickwork, we said there was a planned period of 3 weeks, but we'd want to know where that planned period comes from, and hopefully there'd be an as-planned programme that shows the planned duration. Although often on projects the programme might not show in the level of detail that we want the planned activities. So there could be an activity for all of the brickwork on site, and it might not identify individual walls. And so it means that there's an exercise that we'd have to undertake where we'd work out or try and come up with an estimate of what the planned period for a particular wall should have been. Then we'd want to know what actually happened. So to do that, we'd need to look at as-built records. So on this example, we've got a delay of 1 week at the very start of the brickwork. So that should be fairly easy to work out if there's been a delayed commencement. But often it could be more complicated. There could be a series of delays that happen during the construction of the brickwork. So there could be 3 or 4 smaller delay events, each causing 1 or 2 days of delay. So if there has been a delay, we'd want to know what's caused it, and we want to know the overall period of delay, when it occurred, and we want to know as well whether the event has had a critical effect on the completion date. So we'd have to understand how that activity fits in with the overall programme and with the overall planned completion of the project. And by looking at the critical path and explaining the delay events and their effect, we'd want to try and link the cause of the delay and its effect. So we can really demonstrate that a particular event has caused the prolongation of the project. So to do that, whilst it's probably okay if we're looking at like big periods of delay, so we could work out perhaps that there's been a 1 week delay to the brickwork, we might need to look at other records to try and fine tune that. And sometimes it's necessary to do a day by day narrative, explaining all of the construction process and explaining all of the delays to a particular activity, especially if it's on the critical path and is important for the overall project. So here are some examples on the slide of some of the records that we might see. So there could be a progress report, which records the progress percentages against the original programme activities. And from that, we could construct an as-built programme, and we could see broadly when activities were done. So we'd know what the progress was at one progress period, and then we'd compare that to the progress reported at the next progress reporting date. And we can see the overall progress made sometime during that window of time. So that gives us an idea of what's happened, and that's useful as a first pass through the project, working out broadly what's happened and trying to identify probably what's critical and what delay events or activities we need to look at in a bit more detail. But to then look at those in more detail, we need more records, so we can really demonstrate the cause and the effect of the delay events. So one record that I really like are progress photographs. So sometimes we see time-lapse cameras have been set up on site, and they'll take a photograph of the site. Sometimes it's every 15 minutes, as frequently as that. and that gives us an idea of where people are working and what work they all carried out, and it shows what equipment is being used, and that can be used to produce an incredibly detailed as-built record of the progress of the works. It's a bit more difficult when it comes to the fit-out stage and when a camera can't capture all of the site or the working area, but it's useful for works to the envelope and to the substructure. There's also the site diary, so we'd hope to see entries in there to explain what people are doing on a particular day. Maybe it'll identify what they're doing in the morning and the afternoon, and we can fine-tune it even more. And it's really good evidence to explain what's happened and to show and demonstrate the cause and effect, because that's the overall aim when we're looking at delay and trying to demonstrate it. Sometimes there isn't a progress report done against the programme, but hopefully the quantity surveyor will have done valuations and recorded in some detail the percentage value of the activities that have been carried out. So that could be one way of preparing a bit of an overview as built of the progress of activities. We also see marked up drawings showing when slabs were poured and showing which parts of the slabs were poured, and often they're just hand marked on site with a highlighter with a date shown. So these are all very useful records, and sometimes though when we look at projects that have been completed, it can be quite complicated, and it is a very time consuming job to go through trawling these documents to build a story of what's happened on the project. So it's useful if the project records are collated during the work. So sometimes we see a schedule put together. We call it a delay schedule, a D schedule, where all the records associated with a particular delay event are all collected, and each delay event is given a reference number, and all the records are pulled together, so you can tell a story for each event. But obviously there's quite a lot of work involved in that in terms of administration on site. When it comes to recording and mapping efficiency, so when we're looking at disruption, there are three things that we really need to look at, and these were described by Mr. Justice Aikenhead in Water Lily. So the first thing is that we have to show that an event has occurred, which gives entitlement to loss and expense. So we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a minute. We also have to show that the event caused disruption, and we have to show that the disruption caused loss and or expense to be incurred. So we'll go and have a look at these in a bit more detail. So the first thing is to show that an event occurred, which gives entitlement to loss and expense. So it comes back to records again. So it might seem obvious during the project what's caused the delay, but often we're looking at projects that have been completed and we're going back trying to identify the events that have occurred. And we really would need good records to understand what's happened and to evidence it and demonstrate the event and tell a story of the event. But that event also has to give entitlement to loss and expense. So we need to look at the contract and see that the event is an event for which compensation can be given. So often we see contracts that have quite onerous clauses in where it's necessary to give notification that an event has occurred. And sometimes there are time bars attached to these clauses. So if you don't give notice on time, then you could lose all of your entitlement. So that's a very important thing to look out for, especially on amended contracts and on NEC contracts as well. We also need to prove that the event caused disruption, and we have to show that the disruption caused loss and or expense to be incurred. So there are some methods here, and these are methods that are set out in the Society of Construction Law Delay and Disruption Protocol. So the first group of methods are the productivity-based methods. So they're really to do with the actual productivity on site. We're measuring outputs and comparing those to either planned outputs or estimated outputs or to industry standards. Then we have the cost-based methods. So that's really where there aren't records of what the outputs are in terms of like the number of bricks that are cubic meters of concrete that are poured or tonnage of steel that can be tied. in a particular amount of time, but these are based on the estimated costs against the actual costs incurred. And sometimes we see like total cost claims. So a contractor might discover that they've spent more on the project they were planning to, then they'd try and identify the reasons for that. And sometimes you see claims where they just try and claim the difference between what they estimated originally and what the actual cost was. And they try and label it as disruption, but it really needs to identify the events that have occurred that have caused a particular amount of additional cost. So we have to show the cause and effect between the event, so the disruptive event, and the effects on productivity and cost. So we'll go and look at some of these in a bit more detail. There's quite a few. The measured mile is probably the one of the most highly regarded. It's probably one of the most robust methods. So in a measured mile analysis, we'd look at the production on that project, or maybe on a different project if we can't find a good measure on this project. We'd look at what the actual rate of production was during a period when there wasn't disruption, and then we'd compare that against the rate of production that occurred or was achieved when there was disruption. So do a comparison between the two. Another method that we sometimes use, and it's one that I quite like because it can be represented on a graph, and hopefully it helps illustrate and show what the effect of the disruption is. It gives a good visual representation. So on this line of balance, this is for piling works, the breaking down of piles, the construction of a pile cap, and then the construction of ground beams. So the red bars represent the piling works. So if we have a look at those first, the solid line represents the planned piling works. So you can see the number of piles that are planned to be installed against time. And then the dashed line is what actually happens. So on there, we can see periods where the line is a lot flatter or a lot shallower than was planned. So we'd want to go then and look at the records for those periods and identify the reasons why the productivity wasn't what was planned. And then we could see the effect then on the follow-on trades or the follow-on activities to do with the piling. So you can see that there's a delay then to the green activities, which is the breaking down of the top of the piles. So it's good for identifying when the delay or when the disruption occurred and when the lack of productivity occurred. And from the line of balance as well, we can actually see periods of delay because we can look at how much the period of time between the planned and the actual. So we can get a measure of the amount of delay that's occurred at a particular stage in the process. So I do like that. I think it's quite convincing when you can prepare a graph that just shows quite simply what's happened. So I've sort of described some of the cost-based methods. So these really aren't as robust as the productivity methods, but they can be used if the records aren't available. So really, it's very important to make sure that there are good records of what was planned and what actually happened on the project. So there we go. It just emphasised that we really need good records. So one of the issues at the moment is the effect of COVID. And there are some things that need to be considered when preparing a programme and when assessing delay and disruption. So some of the issues have been described earlier, and one of them is there could be limitations on the number of men that are or tradespeople that are allowed on site at a particular time. So here we have a busy site canteen, which we're unlikely to see for a while. There could be issues with, especially on tall buildings, there could be issues with people getting to the work face. So if there's a tall building that's relying on a hoist, it could take a long time to get to the upper floors of the building if they can only use stairs. And it also depends a lot on the site. So there could be there could be high intensity work being carried out, like in commercial fit out, where a lot of the work is carried out at high pace, but there's lots of people working in the same area at the same time, so they're more likely to be affected by the restrictions and the rules that are in place because of COVID. So there are some ways that the programme can be used to help demonstrate the effect of the resourcing and the number of people that are allowed on site in a particular area. So on this programme, we've got a plan for the remaining work post-COVID. So with the new restrictions in place that could be implemented. So we've got a plan for the work. And what we've done is we've added resourcing to this programme. So at the bottom of the graph, there's a histogram which shows the number of people that are planned to be on site on each day. And so if there's a limitation on the number of people that can be working, the programme will need to be adjusted until the histogram shows a flat line, or shows that the maximum number of people that will be on site at a particular time is below like the maximum threshold. So that then show what the effect is on the timing of particular activities. And there are ways of auto leveling, so the programming software calculates what the effect is, but it's probably better to manually adjust activities and move them to sensible timings to achieve the required or the maximum level of resourcing. And of course you code it for particular areas of the project. So if there's zone 2 where there's a maximum number of people that could be worked, you could produce a graph showing the number of people that would be working in zone 2, and then the same for zone 3 on this programme. So that could be a useful tool for illustrating and showing to the employer what the effect is of the new restrictions. So later on we're going to have a look at mitigation and acceleration, and it's quite important what the contract does. But we'll hand over back to Dean. Thank you.
In this section we'll focus on the contract mechanisms surrounding any extension of time and loss on expense claims. Initially we'll focus on the JCT contract, and the information contained within these slides is based on the JCT Design and Build 2016 contract. Now, with any extension of time claim, the information contained within the contract particulars needs to be focused on, in particular 1.1, which is the date for completion, and also any dates for completion of any sections, if applicable. Also the dates for possession of the works, and the dates for possession of any sections under clause 2.3 need to be considered. Now, with the JCT contracts and obligations to time, focus needs to be put onto the contractual dates and any sectional completion dates. Generally, a programme is not a contract document within the JCT. However, the standard building contract does allow for a master programme to be included. However, there's no requirement under the JCT Design and Build for a contractor's programme. That said, the employer's requirements will need to be checked to ensure that any obligations are not placed on a contractor to provide this under those. Now, for a contractor to issue a valid notice, clause 2.24 needs to be considered. And this requires that the contractor to notify the employer as soon as it becomes apparent that the progress of the works is likely to be delayed. And this should include the material circumstances for the delay, and should identify in the notice which relevant event is applicable. The contractor shall give particulars of each event expected, and shall include an estimate of the effect on the delay in the completion of the works or any section of the works. And then finally, if there are any material changes to these estimates provided by the contractor should notify the employer immediately. Now, relevant events under the JCT are changes, employer's instructions, the deferment of giving possession, compliance with clause 3.15, suspension by the contractor, any impediment, prevention or default by the employer, statutory works, exceptionally adverse weather conditions, specified perils, civil commotion or the use of threat or terrorism, strikes, exercise of a statutory power, delay in receipt of permissions or approvals, and force majeure. Now, the JCT on loss and expense is focused around clause 4.20, and this is matters material affecting regular progress. Now, if the contractor is likely to incur any direct loss and expense, this needs to be notified immediately to the employer. This should be done as soon as it becomes apparent that the regular progress is likely to be affected. And in support of this, the contractor shall provide any information that the employer may reasonably require to ascertain any loss and expense. The relevant matters that should be referenced within this clause are changes, employer's instructions, compliance with clause 3.15, any impediment prevention or default, or delay in receipt of permissions or approvals. Now, the contractor's estimates under the JCT can also be dealt with via the supplementary provisions if they're included, and this will be via Schedule 2, Part 1, Paragraph 3. When these are used, these modify clauses 4.20 to 4.23, and this requires that the contractor submits estimates within interim applications for payment for any direct loss and expense, which is to be added to the contract sum. And the contractor may continue to do this so long as he is incurring direct loss and expense. Now, within 21 days of receipt of this from the contractor, the employer is to either accept these estimates, wish to negotiate or refer the matter to adjudication, or he may insist that the provisions of clause 4.19 and 4.2 are to apply and that we move away from the supplementary provisions. If the estimate is accepted, that shall be added to the contract sum, and no further amount shall be included under 4.20 of the contract. However, if the contractor breaches clause 3.2 and 3.3 of the supplementary provisions, then clause 4.20 will now become back in force. In terms of force majeure, there's been a lot written at the Times about whether force majeure in terms of COVID would be a reasonable approach. Now, force majeure is a French civil law concept that was introduced due to the narrow application of the frustration doctrine. This has evolved over the years to include coal strikes, wars and epidemics. Now, some parties may actually attempt to define force majeure, a bit like the relevant events do, and create a list of things that could be classed as force majeure events. And they will also look to place at the end a catch-all piece of terminology. Now, where this is to be used, great care needs to be taken, as applying such a phrase can lead to the adjustum generis, or of the same kind or principle, or same kind or class principle applying. In our opinion, we believe it would be difficult to demonstrate a force majeure claim due to the fact that sites have not closed and therefore there is no clear delay. And for a successful force majeure claim to be introduced, it's not enough that the works are slightly more difficult or would cost slightly more to actually be constructed. It needs to be something along the frustration or prevention doctrine. Now, the principal differences between the NEC contract and the JCT is that the programme is paramount on NEC contracts, whereas only the standard building contract requires a programme under the JCT. Under the NEC, all compensation events must be impacted on the programme. Time and quantum are separate on the JCT, whereas both need to be considered for any variations that are put in place via a compensation event under the NEC. Now, the JCT is often amended to include strict timescales for notices. However, that said, great care needs to be taken to consider Z clauses within the NEC, as this could also be the case under an NEC contract. Now, as with the JCT, for any extension of time or loss and expense claim, the contract data and the information contained within the contract data needs to be considered, specifically those relating to time and the starting dates and the completion date for the works, and also if any key dates are to be imposed. Now, for the NEC, under clause 16.1, the contractor and the project manager are to give an early warning notice of any potential increase to the total prices, delay to completion, or the delay in meeting a key date. And under clause 61.5, the project manager can inform the contractor if, in his opinion, the contractor has failed to issue an early warning notice. Clause 31.1 of the contract requires that the contractor submits a first programme to the project manager for acceptance within the period stated. And clause 31.2 details what the contractor is to show in each programme, which as a minimum should be the starting date access dates, any key dates and the completion date, the order and timing to provide the works, dates when any conditions for key dates and other items need to be met, provisions for float and time risk allowances and any health and safety requirements that need meeting, the date when, in order to provide the works, the contractor needs any information from the employer, as well as all other information that the contractor deems important to put into the works information. Now, within 2 weeks from the project manager receiving this, he either accepts the programme or notifies the contractor for the reasons for rejecting it. Now, this could be because the plans are not practical, it does not show the required information, or it does not represent a realistic plan. Now, the contractor should on each revised programme show the actual progress achieved, the effect of any implemented compensation events, how the contractor plans to deal with any delays and corrected notified defects, along with any other changes which the contractor wishes to make. And these revised programmes should be issued as a minimum within the period for reply after the project manager has instructed the contractor to do so. When the contractor chooses, however, at no longer intervals than the dates required within the contract data. Now, finally, under the NEC contract, there are 19 compensation events, and there are 3 different types of notification that can be made for compensation events. Clause 61.1 is the project manager notifying the contractor and requiring that the contractor issues a quotation, however, immediately puts those works into effect. Clause 61.2 is that the project manager instructs the contractor to submit a quotation, however, the contractor should not put these proposed changes into effect until notified to do so by the project manager. And finally, that the contractor notifies the project manager of anything which he believes is an event under the compensation events system, or that the project manager has not notified to the contractor. However, great care needs to be put in place to ensure that this is done within 8 weeks of becoming aware of an event. Otherwise, failure to do so may result in the contractor not receiving a change to the prices or key dates. And again, please check the Z clauses to ensure that this 8-week period has not been reduced.
Thank you, Dean. So we're going to have a look at acceleration now. And there are a couple of definitions that it's useful just to have a quick look at. So there's a definition here for mitigation. So that's to lessen severity or lessen the amount of delay or disruption, and so reduce the overall cost or loss that occurs. Acceleration, so that's to increase the productivity or reduce the planned duration of the remaining activities. So that could change the planned completion date or the contractual completion date and make it earlier than it would have been otherwise. So acceleration is sometimes defined in a contract, and it is defined in most of the widely used standard forms of contract. So Dean's going to have a look at some of the contractual provisions a bit later, but it's probably useful just to have a quick look at the programme and some of the things that we need to consider when there's acceleration. So here we've got a programme where there's acceleration. And because acceleration is instructed and it's usually by agreement, there's a defined point in time at which it happens or from which it's assessed. So in this programme, we've taken progress to near the end of March, and we've worked out what the progress of the works was at that date. So that's shown on the left hand side of the programme with the green and yellow bars. So the black shading on the green bars is the amount of progress, or shows that the activities have been progressed. And then because we know what's happened, we can use the programme and project forwards and work out what the plan is for the remaining works based on the logic links between the different activities. And we can calculate what the revised plan completion date should be. And we've also, because this is related to COVID, we've resource loaded the programme because we want to show what the planned resourcing is to achieve this acceleration. So at the bottom of the graph, we've got a histogram that's coloured green. So that shows the planned resourcing, and that can be adjusted by moving the bars. So while we're working out what the acceleration will be, we can adjust the bars on the programme and work it so that the level of resourcing is kept below a maximum permissible limit that's safe for working on that site. So we've got a plan for the remaining works when we return to site in April. Some points though that need to be considered when we're dealing with acceleration is that there's usually a negotiation that takes place, and there's usually discussions, and that can take some time to happen. So during that period of discussion, there could be other events that happen. So there could be more delay events or disruption events that will have an effect on the programme. So they could cause a change to the completion date. So it's important to make sure that we know whether or not they are included in the acceleration agreement, because there could be events that occur that are caught up or wrapped up in the revised earlier completion date, but which makes the date that we've agreed unachievable. And we also have to have a look at some of the delay events and disruptive events that we know are going to happen but might not have been shown on the programme. So there could have been a change to the design, and we could be carrying out design work in a drawing office, and we could be procuring materials associated with that. And it could be some time before that actually has an effect on site. And so the effects might not have been shown on the programme yet, but it's an event that we should know about and probably should have impacted. So that's one of the things that often gets missed and should be looked at very carefully before agreeing to accelerate the works. So I'm going to hand back to Dean now. He's going to go through some of the contractual provisions. Thanks.
In terms of acceleration, again we'll focus on the JCT contract mechanism surrounding these first, and then we'll move on to the NEC and consider any acceleration agreements which fall outside of the contract. So in terms of the JCT, acceleration is dealt with via Part 2 of the Supplementary Provisions, Schedule 2. Now, this requires that the employer can request the contractor to submit a proposal which is referred to as the acceleration quotation. Now, upon receipt, the contractor can provide the acceleration quotation, identifying the time that can be saved and adjustments to the contract sum, or he can explain why it will be impractical to achieve practical completion earlier than the completion date. At any point, the employer may seek revised proposals from the contractor. However, the contractor shall be under no obligation to put any of these into effect until he receives what is referred to as the confirmed acceptance from the employer. Now, the acceleration quotation is to be submitted in compliance with the invitation issued by the employer, and this should be done not later than 21 days from the date of receipt of the invitation, or from such point that the contractor receives enough information to allow him to submit a quotation. The only way this can happen later than 21 days is unless both parties agree to this. And that quotation is to remain open to the employer for acceptance for 7 days from receipt. If the employer wishes to accept the quotation, he shall issue the confirmed acceptance, stating what the adjustment to the contract sum is, and any adjustment to the time required for completion, as well as any other conditions referenced in clause 6.1.1.1. Now, if an acceleration quotation is not accepted, the contractor may be allowed to receive a fair and reasonable allowance to the contract sum, provided that the quotation was prepared on a fair and reasonable basis. Under the NEC, these are dealt with in the core conditions, and this is clause 36.1, where the project manager may instruct the contractor to submit a quotation to accelerate, and the project manager must state any changes to the key dates that are to be included. The contractor is to submit a quotation for acceleration along with a revised programme showing the effect of the acceleration on the completion date, or any key dates if these are applicable. And the contractor is to submit a quotation or provide reasons for not submitting a quotation within the period for reply. Now, this is separate from the compensation event process, and it is important to note that the contract is silent on the process following the submission, i.e. it does not give timescales for when the employer has to accept this and what happens if he doesn't accept it. And then finally, acceleration agreements outside of the contract. Now, these are probably the most prominent rather than acceleration agreements that are within the JCT and the NEC. However, for acceleration agreement to be operable, the parties need to consider all potential outcomes and where the risk sits with this and who carries that risk. And in our opinion, acceleration agreements should be drafted on actions rather than time. For example, a contractor may do all that he reasonably can do, however does not receive information in the correct time to allow him to meet what they propose to do in the acceleration agreement, and therefore what would the impact of this be? Therefore, actions rather than time would be more appropriate. And finally, the acceleration agreement should also consider what impact any instructions that are issued throughout this acceleration period are to have and how they are dealt with.
That brings this webinar to an end. So thanks to Dean and Dave for their input. And thank you for watching. We hope you found this helpful and informative. Just a final reminder, you do have the option of submitting questions. So please write to us with any questions on today's webinar, or indeed any feedback and notes of anything you'd like to see covered in future webinars. So keep a lookout for those future webinars. Our next one will cover tips for successful smash and grab adjudications, and tips if and when your construction project is suspended. We will be giving more details out on these webinars in due course. With your registration, you should have received a link to enable you to view this webinar again. So it will always be available for you to view via that link if you would like to view it again, or indeed share it with your colleagues. And if you need any services or advice, not just on what was covered in this webinar, but any contractual, commercial, or planning and programming matters, all our details are on our website. We are still operating as normally, remotely. So please visit our website to see what kind of services we can offer. So thanks again for watching. Hope you join Ramsgill Martin again for the next one.